Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 7. Blade. Present day. Tunja, Colombia. Mercedes grew up in this town. As an adult, now in her late 40s, she looked around and wondered what had become of her innocent town. A town that, before the world went dark, was a closely knit community where everybody took care of each other. But just like the fate of all the good things in this world, so too did her unfortunate birthplace slowly meet its demise. Over the years, she saw stranger turn on stranger, neighbor turn on neighbor, and family turn on family. She watched as this new and dark world around her slowly seeped into her hometown. From becoming desperate for survival, ripping each other apart, placing each resident in a position of sleepless defense, to the threat of outsiders confronting this jungle town in order to shore up their own supplies, merely attempting to survive themselves. She stood about 5.5 feet tall and was of average height among the females of her family. She had long, dark, straight hair that framed her beautiful, yet hardened and tired face, while the shadows of the overcasting clouds played across the ground. She felt lost in the crowd as she attempted to find her bearings. As she took in the unfolding drama around her, accompanied with this newest threat that had just taken over her town, her eyes seemed to shimmer as she visibly absorbed her surroundings underneath a pale sunlight. As she stood in the line that was mostly made up of neighbors and friends of hers, she looked from here to there, trying to see if she could spot a relative, perhaps one of her sisters, or maybe even one of her adult children. Just somebody she trusted. She had been standing in this line since early morning and was still in the dark as to what exactly was happening. All she knew was that the Russian military, along with the Beltran Leyva, claiming to be helping the Colombian government secure their nation, had infiltrated her town upon daybreak, as her and her entire community were then forced to be processed. She squinted in the shimmering sunlight as her attention was again drawn to the cartel soldier, currently speaking through a megaphone. All morning, he had been repeating the same words over and over, every 10 minutes or so. Attention. Your community is under the control and protection of the locally re-established military of Colombia. All residents must be processed. Your cooperation is appreciated. Please find the line with the first letter of your last name and line up accordingly. Registration for processing is required for all people over the age of 8. You must remain in your lines until you have been registered for processing. Thank you for your cooperation. The line seemed to be moving incredibly slow as she tried to make sense of why her whole community had to be processed. But now, after hours in line, she finally came up to a table where she saw a man sitting while holding a clipboard and a pen. There were several sheets of paper on the clipboard, with last names listed on it from top to bottom, some with checks next to their names, and some without. Aside from the disconcerting events taking place from all around, how they got this list was confusing her the most. After all, it wasn't as if there was still even any semblance of record-keeping these days. But this puzzling mystery seemed to be the least of her worries, wondering what was to become of her and her community as she looked down at the sitting man, now directly in front of her. Behind him stood a Russian soldier in military fatigues with a rifle, standing guard. The man sitting down, who appeared to be a cartel soldier, looked at Mercedes and spoke, directing her to comply with an answer.
Apellido, por favor,
he said, gaining a somewhat quick response from the woman as she gave him her last name as he'd requested. My last name is Perez, she said. The man flipped a couple of pages and moved his pen halfway down a page. As he came to a stop, and without looking back up at her, he posed his next question in a manner as if he were growing bored of his repetitious duties. And as he asked her to verify her first name, she looked down at him and spoke once more. Mercedes, she softly said, while feeling more vulnerable by each passing second. He then looked her up and down and said something that seemed to confuse her, as he also wrote down the number 3 next to her name. 70 kilograms. And then after saying that, he gestured for her hand as he used a marker to write the number 3 on its backside as well. And with that, the man checked her name off and gave her an order in Spanish, obviously directing her to proceed to her next step in being processed. And trying to remain calm while doing so, she followed the man's directions when she eventually looked up and saw where her fellow townspeople were being funneled. Just beyond the table, a gate within a fence, which all had a tarp covering it, preventing the people at the front of the registration lines to see where they were being sent, soon began to open. There, on the other side, sat a large truck with about 15 or so people standing on its bed. They were all confined by the safety guards surrounding them and keeping them inside. And there, near the back door to the truck, still open, was an armed Russian soldier ordering her to board. So, not wanting to cause herself more problems than she already seemed to have, she complied with the soldier and boarded the large vehicle. Once inside, she began to look around. Still not seeing any relatives, she felt slightly comforted as many familiar and friendly faces from the town were there to greet her. Over the next hour or so, she watched as about a dozen more people were added to the truck's bed, each of them, like her, sporting a number 3 on their hands. Still not seeing any of her family, she hoped that they were doing okay as she felt the engine to the vehicle turn on, prompting the guard that had ordered her to board the large truck to close the metal door, shutting them in all together. They soon made their departure as they each bumped into one another, as if she somehow gained a momentary ability of clairvoyance. She could not help but feel like cattle being transported around as she looked at her hand with the number 3 on it, as if she felt branded. She remembered when she was younger, the ranch her father owned, numbering cattle was routine. The cattle, marked with a number that corresponded to their weight, would then be sent off to be slaughtered together, streamlining the butchering process. Then, once slaughtered, they would be grouped together in bags with that number printed on the outside of it. But Mercedes shook this thought from her mind as she felt she were being overly paranoid. Surely this world she found herself in hadn't sunk to such a depraved level, right? But as they made their way along the sandy dirt road, and eventually, after what seemed to take a lifetime, Her anxiety only grew as the truck slowed to a full stop in front of an old, abandoned warehouse, not making her feel any better in the slightest. The truck engine turned off and the door to the back of the vehicle opened. The same Russian standing outside that had ordered her onto the vehicle now ordered everyone to disembark. She made her way out of the truck and down to the dirt as she felt herself being pushed this way and that by the disorderly fashion of 20+ adults trying to exit through one small opening. Once on solid ground, she began to fall into place with her equals as her new superiors began loudly barking orders. To her surprise, they were guiding them all up to the roof of the small warehouse by way of a ladder that was welded to the side of the old concrete structure. Once at the top, she saw something that, however out of place it seemed, made her heart skip a beat as her breath was momentarily robbed from her lungs. Across the rooftop, on the other side, sat chains and shackles that were fixed to the roof's edge, opposite the side they had come up. The shackles lined the edge and seemed to be in pairs, as several chains each led to their very own 2 ankle restraints. As if that wasn't alarming enough, any thoughts of the shackles being there, simply by coincidence and not meant for them, were quickly ushered away as she could see there were plenty of them for everyone. The soldiers then began yelling and pointing for them to sit down in a single file near the shackles, as a momentary spark of protest came from several members within the rooftop community. This, however, was quickly silenced as a cartel soldier opened fire with his rifle, only using one arm, aimlessly firing into the sky, gathering his prisoner's attention. He then placed a familiar megaphone to his lips as he began to address the worried crowd in Spanish. "Please cooperate. You will not be harmed. This is part of the process. You must undergo a small medical exam. Once completed, those not sick will be able to enter the warehouse through the roof's hatch door, where there is food and water. This will keep the sick from contaminating the warehouse's interior. Those who are sick will be sent to another camp for rehabilitation, where they too will also receive food and water. This is for your safety. All residents over 8 must be processed. Please kindly take a seat. The military and the government of Colombia thanks you for your cooperation." He said this while gesturing for them to sit near the shackles that were laying a few feet from the edge. As they did so, several men began fixing shackles to the feet of everyone there. Mercedes noticed the wooden platform they were sitting on did not match the rest of the rooftop. It was quite large as it fit all who sat upon it, and stretched over roughly 30 feet of the roof's edge. The wood seemed relatively new and somewhat out of place atop the tattered building as she waited her turn to be cuffed. Her heart raced as she felt her blood pump furiously through her veins while she tried to remain calm. Surely, they're not just going to simply kill us. What value would we be to them then? She desperately thought to herself, trying to grasp a shred of hope into what seemed like a bleak direction she found herself heading in. Soon, she realized that she was probably right as she listened to the comfort the man's next words provided her with, as everyone around her seemed to simultaneously breathe a sigh of relief as he spoke. This exercise is nearly over. Soon you will all be released. Thank you for your continued cooperation. With that, all the men behind the shackled prisoners lifted the wooden platform they sat on as they tipped the hostages off of the building. As everyone began to scramble, trying not to fall, Mercedes could barely hear the sounds of screaming as her own survival instincts kicked into high gear. She watched as the plank of wood slowly became a steep ramp that she resisted sliding off with all her will. The man next to her was clambering to the edge of the top of the wood as he suddenly pulled his hand back in pain. She watched in horror as he realized the tips of his fingers had simply been sliced off by one of the men, now holding the large plank on its side in order to move him along with being processed more quickly. This caused her to panic as she clung to the platform, now practically standing fully erect as she watched her neighbors drop off the side of the large building, one by one. And now, being able to see the ground below, on the other side of the warehouse, she noticed piles upon piles of dead bodies, having already gone through what was currently taking place around her. This dreadful and hair-raising scene depicted a haunting answer as to where people were being sent from the registration tables, now a few miles away. Soldiers around the piles of bodies were paired up, each grabbing one body at a time and simply pitching them into smaller truck beds parked nearby. As the horror show below played before the eyes of the poor souls now scrambling and pleading for their lives, they fell to the side of the cold cement structure, most surviving with minor injuries. Others, however, were lucky, as they were simply knocked out cold upon slamming into the hard cement wall, only left there to dangle in upside-down positions. Mercedes was one of the last to fall to the side of the building, as the plank eventually became inverted, soon free-falling itself, leaving no more possibility for the prisoners to cling on, as it fell past them, crashing to the earth below. As she fell, she screamed, not knowing where she would land, as a sudden pain spread throughout her entire body, onset by an abrupt stop. She was now dangling upside down, several feet over the ground below, as her ankles each broke from their joints, cartilage snapping from their places. Her now fragmented bones splintered as they pierced her skin and rubbed up hard against her steel restraints, causing her to scream from the excruciating pain. She could now feel the blood in her throat as she felt the need to throw up, but simply could not, since gravity was not on her side at the moment. Instead, she hung helplessly, upside down against the cold cement siding. Then, and slowly, she began to go in and out of consciousness as she felt the wall behind her hit her a few more times while her chains thrashed her about, slowly swinging, less and less. Soon, Mercedes was finally able to gain a small amount of focus as she looked over at the man dangling next to her. His face had been completely removed from being bludgeoned against the wall. She could see him spitting up blood from where his mouth used to be, now just broken teeth and hair, messily out of place. And as if that were not enough, she then noticed a man, upside down to her perspective, yet firmly walking on the ground. As he marched by each one of the dangling victims, he casually sliced their necks open with a large blade, allowing them to bleed out. He did so while smoking a cigar. And alas, this so-called processing became exceedingly clear to one Mercedes Perez. Her eyes grew larger as he quickly made his way to her while she tried to let out a scream. But then, to her surprise, he passed right by, moving on to the next one after her. Was she skipped? She had thought. But in fact, the blade had been so sharp, she hadn't even felt it. And when she finally tried to let out a scream, she was instead met with a new and opening wound within her throat. As while sounds from her screams slightly came out, those sounds were not from her lips. It appeared as though her throat had been cut after all, as an unsettling coldness quickly overtook Mercedes' entire body. She then slowly closed her eyes and lost consciousness as the images of soldiers tossing dead bodies about quickly burned within her rapidly and expiring mind. And as her world went dark, she noticed one final detail: a number 3 on each of the trucks that were carrying dead bodies away. Looking back at his work, he reviewed the carcasses now all hanging along the warehouse wall. Satisfied that all were now properly bleeding out, he brought a radio to his face and began to speak while holding down the radio's button. As he did so, another soldier came up to him and quietly spoke in his ear, making the executioner slightly shudder. Meanwhile, back at the capital of Tunja, the Chancellor was meeting with his last remaining general and brother, Nicholas. As the two spoke privately, a man entered the room. It was a cartel soldier, and he had an update for his boss. "Sir, another batch has been completed." The Chancellor looked at his soldier and responded loudly. "Good work. Make sure that we process the entire west side of the town. I want to have the whole town processed and packaged in the next few days. We have already identified a few towns we can move to after this one. The children will move with us, and after a few towns, we will be able to grow our own product as well. And remember, we are skipping the feedlots altogether. So, we must process as many as we can to reach the agreed-upon weight. We need to stick to these plans, Lieutenant. Soon we will be able to sustain our own empire. Fuck these Russian leaders, micromanaging us from afar." The soldier dutifully replied. "Yes, sir. One more thing, sir." The Chancellor looked up at the soldier as Nicholas joined him in doing so. "We received word from one of our spies that there are troops moving this way from Esmeralda." Chancellor became slightly upset, but remained calm as he spoke to the soldier. "And what did my spy tell you, Signor?" The soldier became nervous as he looked at Nicholas and then back at the Chancellor. "Sir, it's the Sinaloa. Signor Shields was spotted along with the others. They believe Lenkov is moving against you, and he's recruited our northern rivals." The Chancellor's forehead began to turn red as a vein became apparent, while it began pulsating above his brow. He spoke quietly and calmly, making the poor soldier feel a lot more nervous now. "And did he see anyone else of importance?" The soldier looked at the Chancellor straight in his eyes, knowing there was no way around it, and clearly answered him, not knowing the reaction his boss would have. "Sir, it's Chavez Cruz, sir. He was spotted this morning at the front of the advance, along with Agent Shields." Chancellor took a deep breath and looked to his younger brother. Then Nicholas smiled as the Chancellor slowly grinned. "Very good. Tell your men to pull back. Let them advance." The young soldier, not wanting to know why, simply considered it to be his lucky day and did not press his boss on his new approach at handling such bad news. The Chancellor dismissed the young man and looked at Nicholas. "I really like this Chavez fellow. Young and so very full of life." Nicholas looked at him and replied, "Yes, it is just too bad that he must die." "Yes, so very unfortunate," the Chancellor laughed. Meanwhile, thousands of miles and several time zones away, as one refocuses the remaining faculties that they find themselves desperately clinging to, as the proverbial rug relentlessly pulls from underneath their feet, they discover themselves back in Japan for a much-needed reprieve. Here, seemingly isolated from the rest of this tiny blue rock, the naked eye would note a sort of calm that seemed to be the norm. A norm that was a far cry from the morbid obstacles shared by the larger fraction of humanity. Or at least, so it would seem. Because it is here that the tables will not simply continue to be turned. Instead, they are in complete disarray, unable to discern tabletops from their table legs. And while evening held this island landscape within its grasp, a thin sliver of the nearby moon found its task of lighting the small country quite complicated, as darkness proved to be the victor. Here, within the dense overgrown woodland, just off the abandoned highway, sat a sizable Japanese-style structure, a home 2 stories tall. which served as a stronghold for a well-known crime syndicate. And as peaceful as it may look from the outside, this fleeting image lay in stark contrast to the eerie and ominous events slowly unfolding within its walls. As inside can be found a large open room, lit by the dancing orange and yellow glows of the many candles flickering nearby. As this clearly represents the eerie half of the surroundings, the ominous half simply sat in silence, facing a dozen or so Yakuza members. This scene, however, displayed a contrary theme to their normal routine, as every one of them remained on their knees with their hands on their heads. They all seemed to be looking down at the floor nervously, as if they did not want to gaze upon the men that seemed to have the Yakuza at a large disadvantage. Because there, sitting in a couple of chairs in front of an open door, blocking any would-be escapists from attempting a possible getaway, sat two Hispanic men. As one would have the unfortunate luck of finding themselves in such proximity of these two men, it would be hard to not notice one holding a large hammer while inspecting its sharp metal claws. The other sat quietly while dragging a long, thick nail one would see used on a railroad across the glossy finish of an antique coffee table. The two men sat there in silence, as their reputation needed no introduction, even within this land foreign to them. It was none other than the brothers of the Sinaloa, now nearing their 60s. After several minutes of heart-pounding moments, while flickers of light danced around the room, an intense state of anxiety set in that the Yakuza gangsters never predicted they would find themselves in. At that moment, while keeping their bodies and heads completely still, these Japanese modern warriors sat trembling as the sounds of footsteps began to approach. It is at this one moment in time that a particular Asian gentleman seemed to be singled out as the footsteps appeared to stop below his bowed head. The mysterious stranger in front of him wore black slacks and polished black dress shoes. And that was all the Asian man could see with his face looking down, his hands still upon his head. But then, the stranger placed a finger on the man's chin, encouraging him to look up. While doing so, he avoided looking at the notorious gangsters sitting across from him, still waiting for their turn to explore new options with the hardware they currently admired in the palms of their hands. As his head slowly rose toward his captor, a Hawaiian-style shirt now came into view. And as the several dangling gold necklaces hung loosely around Paco's neck, they only seemed to make things feel that much more off-putting as the brothers waited in silence. Paco cocked his head and looked at the man with pity as he spoke to him like one would speak to a small child. "Don't make this harder for yourself than it has to be, my friend. After all, we wouldn't want our company to lose interest." Paco said this as he looked at the two brothers. Then, looking back down at the rival gangster, he quietly kneeled to the man's side. He drew the attention of his hostage as they both locked eyes. Paco then began to speak once more, drawing from the man a deep fear in his eyes, as he knew his life would soon come to an end. The kinetic signal led us here, led us to a burnt-down home. You know very well, this is Arlo's target. You work for the Chinese, yes? The man then looked at Paco, knowing where he was heading with his line of questioning. And as the man gave a slight nod with his head, Paco continued, "Well, then you know how your Chinese clients would feel about you undercutting his efforts. We know you've seen the capsules. Now, you wouldn't be attempting to get your hands on something of this nature, now, would you?" Paco then knelt in and looked deep into the man's eyes as he spoke softer. "Are you trying to outcompete the Yamaguchi?" Then he looked around the room and then back at the man and posed his next question. "Where is Haruto? Where is your leader?" And as Paco gave the man a moment to answer, seeing a sense of guilt wash over the man's face, he smiled and continued to speak. "Let me guess. He tried to take her, yes. and he wanted to intercept any payload that came with her. You were ordered by your clients to stand down. Arlo wants her taken to him unharmed. She must be dealt with carefully. He then looked back to the brothers as he continued speaking. And you know I am tasked to make sure all factions remain within their jurisdiction. But looking around at what has happened here, Haruto, dead in the back rooms of a supermarket with a hole in his head. Paco then looked back at the man, in time to see a slight expression of shock spread across his face. The man had no idea that Paco knew Haruto had been killed. And as Paco smiled, in response to seeing things add up within his hostage's mind, he spoke once more. You are trying to outmaneuver the Yamaguchi. You are trying to take territory. Paco then leaned in even closer and spoke even softer. My friend, that's against the rules, he said while looking the man squarely in his eyes. And rule breakers must be dealt with. Then, as Paco stood back up, he raised his voice and spoke one last time. Tell me where she is. Tell me, where is this kit? As the evening entered its final phase, the cold sea air took over the sprawling Japanese countryside community. And here, a home sitting amongst the thicket, once a symbol of strength, representing a faction of the greatest warriors within the large Asian island, now slowly being reduced to rubble as the glow of a fire seemed to emanate from inside its walls. And if one were so possessed to peek inside, a ghastly scene would quickly unfold, as a word of the wise would caution said curious creature to simply just look away. For there, among the hardwood floors, struggling bodies tried to escape their creative restraints. Each man now sported long metal nails that penetrated all their extremities many times over. They were all face down on the floor, where they found themselves pinned to their hardwood prison. All this while a fire continued to rage around them, depicting a cramped crematory they would all soon fall prey to. They knew that it was only a matter of time before the fire burned each one of them alive. And with this knowledge came the will to survive. But this will would only be met with a crushing defeat, as their struggles made the pain their nailed limbs were in that much worse.